Welcome, everyone. This is Southern California Water Dialogue. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. We're just waiting for a critical mass. Thank you all for joining. Got a great program. Again, everybody, we're just waiting for critical mass of people. We're going to get started in just a minute with our Southern California Water Dialogue. All right, welcome. This is the Southern California Water Dialogue. We've got a great lineup of speakers for you today. The title is Straight Outta Sacramento, Update on the Climate Resiliency Bond 2024 Budget. We'll have a little legislative discussion as well. My name is Connor Everts. I'm Executive Director of the Southern California Watershed Alliance, and I co-chair with Dee Zink, who's Assistant General Manager of External Affairs for the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. She's going to make a few comments when I'm done with this introduction. So this is I want to thank all of our Water Dialogue Steering Committee members, those that help us put together the monthly meetings. Mostly I want to thank Kathy Caldwell, who pulls it together for us, but also all the technical staff from the Metropolitan Water District as well, Gary and Joanne and others. Without them, this doesn't happen. And also I want to say that if you have other ideas for future dialogues, please let us know. All right, so we will go through the announcements and speakers. The presentations take roughly an hour. The questions are after that. They are a question and answer response that we'll talk about in a second. Dee Zink moderates that part, and then I come back for concluding remarks. These are the webinar ground rules. As you know, webinars don't list all the participants, and you are muted. But if you have any technical difficulties, please use the chat feature to let Joanne know. If you're asking a question, again, use the Q&A feature. And I'm actually getting a message that maybe Dee wants to speak right now. Is that right, Dee?
I can speak anytime you're ready, Connor.
Okay, let me go through the rest of this, and then
Sure.
I'll send it over to you.
Thank you.
Okay, so if you have a poor connection, please move closer to your router or turn off other services that might be using bandwidth. We all have done way too much Zoom. We hope to be meeting in person someday, but go on to the next slide, Gary. Thank you. Again, how to ask a question. So you're not going to use the chat to ask questions. You're actually going to use the Q&A feature, which is in the bottom of your screen in Zoom. Type in a question, click send. You can upvote with the thumbs up and move questions up if you want to hear them. All right, these are our speakers today. We got a great lineup from the legislative perspective, from consulting, Joe Caves, and from Aqua, and then from the Sierra Club. So I will turn it over to Dee, but then our first speaker will be Tina Andolina, who's Chief of Staff of California State Senator Ben Allen.
Thank you, Connor, and welcome everybody. It is a pleasure for Metropolitan to host the Southern California Water Dialogue. And because we're going to be talking about a ballot measure today, I just wanted to inform you up front that Metropolitan has not taken a position on the ballot measure yet. And as a public agency, we're prohibited from expending any district funds to advocate either before or against a ballot measure. So today's program is designed to be informative and educational about the ballot measure. And we welcome the opportunity to bring this information to you today, along with information about the state budget and legislation. So thank you, Connor. I'll turn it back over to you.
All right, Tina, take it away, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate today. Again, my name is Tina Andolina. I'm Chief of Staff to Senator Ben Allen, who represents the 24th Senate District along the western side of LA County. It's a pleasure to be here today. It is extraordinarily exciting to tell you about the Water and Wildfire Bond, which is now on the ballot as Prop 4. For me, it's SB 867. That is the measure that we ran through the legislature to put it on the ballot. And I've been asked today to sort of, give a very brief overview of how we got to where we are today. And it was a 5-year process, so I will be actually very, very brief. We first introduced a bond in 2019, and that was the result of a confluence of a couple of events. One was the failure in 2018 of Prop 3, which was a water bond that was put before the voters, and the voters didn't support it. Senator Allen looked at the needs in that bond, thought that there were a lot of investments there that were extremely important to California, and thought, okay, if we do something through the legislature, maybe we can craft this in a way that we can get voter support for it. So we had that line of thinking, and then this other line coming at the same time, that there were a lot of water needs. There were a lot of needs when it came to wildfire. There were a lot of needs when it came to extreme heat, sea level rise, etc. You'll recall in 2018 the extraordinary fires that we were experiencing up and down the state. So with those two, that confluence of those two concepts, Senator Allen decided to pursue a climate resilience bond that could look at the state investment needs holistically, and tasked us with figuring out if we can put something together that could be supported by the voters. So we began investigating what the state needs were, what was important, what was missing, where the funding gaps were. And there's nothing like introducing a bond to ensure your phone rings off the hook with folks letting you know what those needs are. We spent several years meeting with countless stakeholders who cared about drought, flood, drinking water, groundwater, water recycling, wildfire, home hardening, community hardening, extreme heat, resilience centers, you name it. I can go on and on and on. Identifying what the priorities were, where funding was either in the state, at the federal level. What if we put something in a bond, can we leverage existing resources elsewhere? We spent several years putting together what ended up being introduced in 2023 in SB 867. And I will tell you that process, it was, I would say, more complicated than previous bonds I had worked on. Previous bonds were either resources or parks or water, or maybe a little sprinkling of those things. putting together a bond that tried to more holistically deal with needs in the state was extremely complicated, more complicated than those previous efforts because we had to balance more priorities. And I will say, in those years, it was clear that if I talked to, one stakeholder group, they would say, hey, we want to talk to you about your water bond. I would talk to another stakeholder group and they would say, hey, we want to talk to you about your fire bond or your energy bond. Some people called it a climate bond, but stakeholders saw what we were doing through the lens of their priorities, and it was our job to sort of identify all those priorities and through this extensive stakeholder process, see if we could put together a package that would work. When we reintroduced the bond in 2023 as SB 867, it had come with the learnings that we experienced through the previous years, but it also incorporated what we had been witnessing since when the bond was first introduced in 2019. We were experiencing between 2019 and 2023, we saw more extreme floods. We saw the drought lifting. We saw sea level rise impacts that we hadn't experienced before. Fires, even after 2018, we saw even more devastating fires. We saw the experience between Southern California wildfires and Northern California wildfires and how those should be addressed. And then, of course, we saw the extraordinary drinking water needs really come into clear focus. So we were able to craft 867 in a way that built off of all of the priorities we had heard from entities up and down the state during the previous iterations of the bond. We were able to learn from the investments that the state had made in those intervening years and where those priorities were, where the Investment Reduction Act was coming in from the federal level, but then also the on the ground experiences we were seeing in communities up and down the state. And really, we introduced that bond with so much more information and really feeling like we had a solid sense of what the needs were up and down the state. And I will say that bond was initially $15.5 billion, as you guys all may know, and that still wasn't enough to really tackle the needs that we knew we needed to address. As big as that bond was, we were looking at about $100 billion in needs and asks from the stakeholders we were meeting with. So it was still, just a sliver, a piece of the pie that we knew we needed to fund. And then this year, as we were beginning to see the momentum building behind actually passing it this year, which was very exciting, we were told that we were going to have to cut it down even further. So we were going from the astronomical needs that we knew the state had, and we were already pretty bare bones at 15.5 billion. And then we had to cut it down to 10. At one point, we were asked to cut it down to 9, which was really brutal in the waning months of the process. In cutting it down to $10 billion, we had to make some really hard decisions. Nobody was spared. All of the programs throughout the bond, had to receive a haircut, and we really had to identify what the critical funding priorities were. For this group, I'm happy to say that we managed to keep the water chapter pretty high at $3.8 billion, which is extremely aggressive, and we're excited for that. Everybody is still looking at this thing through their lenses, of course, and through their priorities. And I think, I will say the last couple of months leading up to the final passage of the bond, I will share with this group, we're pretty hit and miss. Like there were times, we might laugh at it now that, we weren't sure 72 hours before the bond passed whether or not it was actually going to pass the legislature. I will be honest with all of you, when Mr. Garcia took the bill up on the assembly floor, I was not sure it was going to pass the assembly floor. So in just the waning hours there, we were still receiving feedback that this entity or that entity wanted more funding and they weren't happy with the final outcome. that said, if you look at when the bill went in print 72 hours before it was passed, the support that has lined up behind the measure, the support that came in flooding from the Saturday night it went into print till when it was taken up on both floors was extraordinary. We were very pleased to see robust support from the environmental community, the water community, folks working on fire, environmental justice groups that care about things like extreme heat and food and agriculture, clean energy, clean air. It was very exciting to see the support coalesce around the measure. And for us, it was, it was really good vindication because we worked hard to ensure that the key priorities that folks expressed to us, from up and down the state, from every stakeholder group, from the members who care deeply about this and who stayed on our radar screen, really ensuring that we could keep those core priorities intact. So we were very pleased to see the support coalesce behind the bond leading up to passage, and the extraordinary bipartisan support that we saw for it, in fact. And it passed on the first call in both houses. So my fear as it was being taken up was unwarranted. There was extraordinary support for it. And now it is Proposition 4 on the November ballot. And I'm gonna hand it over to Joe Caves, who was one of our key partners throughout this effort. And Joe and I have worked together for decades on bonds like this. I will hand it over to him to go through sort of the nuts and bolts of what's in it, the details. But I did want to sort of offer that backward look at how we actually put the measure together. Okay, I'm going to introduce Joe Caves, who is the principal and founder of Conservation Strategies. And I will go on mute. Thank you, Joe.
Well, thank you, Tina. So Tina's really the hero on this whole bond. And as she said, she mentioned briefly, but I don't think, fully acknowledged the 5 years of just heroic effort of battling this out and trying to get to a point where we could pass this bond. Bonds are always a challenge. In the past, as she said, they've been focused on water, they've been focused on parks. This is the first time we've really tried to pull together a comprehensive climate resilience bond. And that was much more challenging in many ways, but I think it probably also represents the future. We're seeing the interaction of all of these different issues of wildfire and water, all this stuff. I think that it dictates probably an organizational approach that we will see in the future. And we're certainly anticipating that we're going to have to build this coalition and work together on it. So I want to walk through quickly the basic elements in this bond. And so can we have the next slide? So the key investment areas, the way it ended up breaking down, and Tina mentioned we started off as a $15.5 billion bond. Once it got cut down to 10, everybody got squeezed, and they got squeezed a lot. We ended up with $3.8 billion in our total water and flood. In the $15 billion version, it was well over $5 billion, but this is where we ended up. The second biggest pot was wildfire and forest resilience at 1.5, then coastal. Extreme heat came in at 450. Now, protecting biodiversity and focusing on nature-based solutions was always a priority for this bond. The state has what they call their 30 by 30 program, which is a long-term goal that by 2030, we're going to protect 30% of the land and water resources of the state. So this is an investment to meet those goals. There's also a component that ended up being added on climate smart farms and ranches at $300 million. And then there's a fairly significant park program. In the end, we added something which it's called the clean air section. It is in fact a clean energy section. And there are three major components there. One is a sort of grid stabilization battery investment. One is money to expand and assist with electric transmission necessary for clean energy investments. And then a $450 million investment for offshore wind, for investments at the ports to support that. So next slide. So let's go through the water investments briefly. I know that's probably the primary focus for you guys. So in water supply and water quality, 1.8 billion, that's the majority. Then there's a flood stormwater management that also includes a fairly significant amount for dam safety, $480 million, and then watershed resilience. Next slide. So the biggest pot of money in the water section was for safe drinking water. And you may have read, I think it was yesterday, the governor put out an announcement that the long-term effort of the state to ensure that everybody has safe drinking water has been making significant progress. We're not all the way there, but this is another investment, 610 million. It's actually the largest pot of money in the water section, and it goes for the water treatment plants and other kinds of investments that are necessary for those communities that don't have safe drinking water or that have a contamination that's preventing them from having safe drinking water. Flood management went to sort of the traditional elements for flood management, money for the Delta, Central Valley Project of Flood Control. There's also stormwater money, which is more typically invested in Southern California projects, and an additional 450 million, not part of that 550 there, that's to address coastal flooding. One of the things we're seeing increasingly is that sea level rise is changing the stormwater systems in urban areas and jeopardizing that infrastructure, and that there's significant investments that are needed on all of our urban waterfronts to try to deal with sea level rise and increasing storm surge. And then finally, water reuse and recycling were major areas. And I know that's of particular importance to Southern California, where recycling is really the best way to provide a drought-proof water supply for urban areas. One of the things that Southern California in particular had asked for was to try to change the water recycling program at the State Water Board so that it allowed for investment in larger recycling projects. One of the challenges has been that the Water Board has taken however much money they have and tended to divide it up into very small increments so they could spread it as far as possible, but that meant relatively small grants. And that doesn't really support the large water recycling plants that really are the most cost effective. Next slide, please. I mentioned dam safety is an increasing area of concern, particularly due to climate change. There's a very significant amount of investment that's needed in this, and this was another one of the priorities the legislature made. And then groundwater storage, banking, conjunctive use. That pot of money is primarily to allow for the implementation of SGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and is going to be necessary to deal with that. There's also a land repurposing segment in that as well, $200 million that allows agricultural land to be taken out of production, fallowed, or put to other use so as to reduce the demand on overdrafted groundwater basins. I mentioned before, there's also $100 million plus for stormwater management projects. Next slide. Oh, okay, you can go back. So I want to give you a couple of kind of overall issues here. So this was a very challenging thing to put together, as we talked about, but in the end, it really did work out. And we ended up with very broad-based and bipartisan support in the legislature, something we haven't really seen in quite a few years. So it's a good indicator that going forward, working together, we should be able to come up with strategies to get more money in this sector. And in addition to the money I've just talked about for water, there's also funds that are going to be important in Southern California and a number of other areas. I would just mention wildfire prevention. In the past, the state has tended to focus on wildfire prevention, and CAL FIRE, the state agency that handles it, primarily in Northern California. We did an analysis 3 years ago, I think it was, right after the Malibu fire, and discovered that of all the wildfire prevention grants given by CAL FIRE in the state, 90% of them went north of the Tehachapi's. Only 10% to LA and south, even though some of the most destructive fires, the wildland urban interface fires, occur in Southern California predominantly. So There's been major investments here for wildfire prevention. There's also funds for LA River restoration. All the local conservancies in the Los Angeles area got significant amounts of money for their natural resource and public access programs. And there's a significant amount of money for coastal protection, as I mentioned before. So there's fairly broad-based investment across the way that will be important to Southern California. I will just mention going forward in the campaign that we're now putting together a campaign around Proposition 4 that's going to include a fairly broad-based coalition. As Tina mentioned, it's all come together now, and we're beginning the process of reaching out and building up that coalition, staffing up the campaign. You may have seen that the PPIC recently did a poll, indicated initial support among voters at about 59% for the measure. So we feel like we're in pretty good shape going forward. And we have a measure that I think will get good support in the press, good support in the public, and we expect to have a very strong coalition on that. So with that, I will turn over to Cindy Tuck, who is the Deputy Executive Director of the Association of California Water Agencies and a longtime friend working on these issues. Cindy?
Thank you, Joe, and good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank the Southern California Water Dialogue for the invitation to be on your program today. This is great. In case you're not familiar with ACWA, we represent public water agencies across the state. Some of them are small, some of them are big, and everything in between. They are all local governments, and together our members deliver about 90% of the water that's delivered in California for the public, for agriculture, and for the economy. I'm going to touch on 3 topics today and not take all day to do it, hopefully. But the 3 topics, the first is state legislation, second is state budget, and then the third, the climate resilience bond. So on state legislation, I'm just going to touch on 2 bills today. The first one has to do with water rights. And the bill number is AB 460, the author, Assemblymember Barakahan. And this is a bill that has been amended to focus in on increasing the penalties that are available to the State Water Resources Control Board for violations involving illegal diversions of water. So this bill, if it's signed into law, will serve as a deterrent to illegal diversions, and the bill is currently at the Senate Appropriations Committee. So that's the first bill, and I'll talk a little longer on the second bill. The second bill has to do with low-income rate assistance, and in California, some agencies have a program, but there is not a state low-income rate assistance program. The bill number is SB 1255 by Senator Durazo. And one thing process-wise on this bill is up until June, it was a study bill. And then they added it's called LIRA, low-income rate assistance, part of the bill into it. So this bill hasn't had any hearings on the Senate side in policy committees or Senate appropriations. It has had a couple policy committee hearings on the Assembly side. It's currently at the Assembly Appropriations Committee. As background, and again, some of you may know this, but I think it's important background, is unlike the energy sector, in water in California, there's not the availability of a lifeline rate. And the reason is because in the state constitution and provisions that were enacted due to the passage of Proposition 218, there's provisions that make it illegal for public water agencies to use rate revenue from some customers to subsidize lower rates for other customers. So that's, you may be wondering, we do it with the energy bill, why aren't we doing it with the water bill? But that's the background. It has to do with constitutional provisions. So for a number of years, there's been several organizations, Aqua being one of them, that have worked on discussions on how do we have a good low-income rate assistance program in California. So this bill, I would say that it's very well intended, but the current version of it, we have some significant concerns about the bill. I'm not going to go through all of those, but I thought I'd flag just what are a couple issues for you, and it'll just illustrate how the details matter. And when you're a local government, a local public water agency, and you're trying to think through how is this going to work, those are the kind of issues we bring to the legislature and say, we want to work on them. We have offered suggested amendments on this bill, but it's complicated. So as background again, what the bill does is says the funding source will be voluntary contributions from the customers that would not be getting the assistance. So it's important. This isn't coming from some state funding source or federal funding source. They would come from voluntary contributions from other customers. So that makes what the funding that's going to be available, it makes that very uncertain, which is makes this complicated. The bill would use an opt-out approach, and what it does is says that the agency would have to provide notice and a customer could opt out of providing the voluntary contribution. One of the concerns we have is that many customers aren't going to see the notice. Maybe they're on auto pay, they don't look at their water bill, that kind of thing. And they're going to be charged what's called a voluntary contribution. They would be able to get a refund later and opt out later, but that part of the process adds to the uncertainty for the funding. So what we're suggesting is an opt-in approach for the bill. So that's one issue. Second issue, quickly, the bill proposes a cap on administrative costs at the agency. So, for example, when the assistance would start going out the door, the admin costs would be limited to no more than 10% of what the voluntary contributions that have come in are. And when you think, you may think, well, gee, that's reasonable. You want to keep those admin costs down. And we understand that. The concern we have, the way it's currently written, is that if a small agency tries to have one new position to implement this, and let's say $70,000 salary plus the benefits, $100,000 just to have easy math, then the contributions would have to be over $1 million. And that is very uncertain for a lot of public water agencies and the communities they serve. So the agencies, they wouldn't be able to cover any difference with other rate revenue from other customers. That would be illegal. So this is just, it illustrates how there's important discussions going on about how do we get a good low-income rate assistance program into California law. So that's the second bill. So moving to the state budget, and a lot of you know, of course, we were in a budget surplus period. That was excellent. And during that time, the governor and the legislature partnered, and they were putting money away, but they were also trying to identify one-time expenditures, not ongoing expenditures, that they could invest some of the surplus in. And water was one of the categories where they worked on. This year, of course, we've been in a budget deficit mode, such a different time. So the legislature and the governor revisited some of the funding decisions they had made before, and we understood, the need to do that. But there have been reductions, reversions, there's different budget terms for this kind of thing, but some of these changes have happened in the water area. I'm not going to go through all that, but just one example is dam safety funding. And Joe had mentioned in the bond context the importance of dam safety, and there's more of a focus on that effort these days. So again, as background, some of the types of projects that are needed, and this is a statewide need, are seismic retrofit projects. And those kinds of projects will increase public safety, but they would also increase available storage for water during wet times, because when they haven't had the dam safety project, they are restricted on how high they can fill the reservoirs. So we have less storage capacity until these projects are completed. So last year, when we weren't in the budget deficit situation, the legislature and the governor approved $100 million, and they created a new program and statute, which is a financial assistance program for dam safety projects. They put $100 million in that, and we were very grateful to have that program created, have the $100 million. But I can tell you, in the water world and for dam safety specifically, that doesn't go very far. Each project, and there are many of these projects, is in the hundreds of millions of dollars or more. And so we really, need to have more investment in that category. I will say that in the budget process, there were, there's budget subcommittee hearings, and there was discussion about cuts, and in different references, they would say, well, maybe this is something the climate resilience bond can help fund, that kind of thing. There were other categories, such, there was cut for PFAS remediation funding. If you're interested in seeing exactly what was done, there's a good summary document, and it's in the climate change chapter in the summary document for the state budget for fiscal year 24-25, and that's available online. And then moving to the climate resilience bond, you heard, great information from Tina and from Joe. Just, again, as background, water projects are very expensive. And I do want to highlight that generally the water customers at a public water agency will pay for most of the project. The agencies need the financial assistance to help get the project over the finish line. It really makes a big difference. And another thing that the bond investment can help in is with keeping water affordable. The affordability of water, as many of you know, is becoming more of an issue. It depends on the local circumstances. For example, do they have PFAS in that area? Do they have Chrome 6 in that area? Do they have nitrate contamination of wells, et cetera? But affordability is a factor. GEO bonds are a good way to fund water infrastructure funding, because it's paid off over a long time, and these projects last for a long time. They're intended, of course, for that purpose. So, we participated in working on the bond. Tina noted this has been happening for years, so lots of participation in that. I do want to give a shout out to Senator Allen and to Tina for their leadership and just patience and persistence, because as Tina noted, this wasn't a one-year thing. This has been going on for several years, and so much input from so many people. This year, the legislature chose to have two working groups. There was a Senate working group, there was an Assembly working group. And when I say working group, those are made up of legislators for the Senate, for the Assembly. They each developed a proposal for their House. That took time. And then they worked to merge their proposals, and that took time. It ended up, as has been noted, at a $10 billion bond. We all would have loved a bigger number, but we're dealing with the state being able to take on so much debt, and how many bonds were going to be on the ballot, that kind of thing. The language for the bond came out into print on June 29th, and that was long awaited. And I know it took a lot of work behind the scenes to get there. I can't even imagine how that was. But it came out June 29th. We saw it on Saturday evening, and that was just in time to make the 72-hour rule that the legislature has, where a bill has to be in print for 72 hours before they have the vote for final passage. The vote was on July 3rd before the recess for the summer. Just kind of cutting to the chase, we reviewed the version of the bond, the June 29th version, and Aqua took a neutral position on the bond. We're not opposing it. We have a neutral position. So just, I want to be very short and brief on this. I'll just say that we would have liked to see more funding for the water categories that we suggested, but we're not opposing the bond. We are at a neutral position, and definitely, respect the work that's happening. In closing, I want to say, for water managers, they are, as you can imagine, they are very focused on climate change. They are on the front line of it and experiencing the impacts like the public is seeing. They are trying, along with the state of California, trying to prepare for longer droughts. There's other countries like Australia that have seen longer droughts that we haven't seen. We're not ready for that. So they're trying to prepare for longer droughts. They're preparing for loss of snowpack. They're preparing for floods. All obviously very critical climate resilience work. It's really important, and I'm sure everybody gets this, but they can't, when they're in the middle of a crisis on a longer drought or in a flood, they can't flip a switch and have a solution. The solutions have to be planned, they have to be permitted, they have to be financed, and then they have to be put into place. All of that takes years. So that's why it's so important to be investing now and having the work go forward so that we are, as a state and with local governments together as partners, that we're ready for the impacts that we think are likely. So I think, that's a key message. I really, again, want to thank the dialogue for being able to be part of this, and I look forward to the questions. And at this point, I'm going to virtually turn the microphone over to Erin Woolley. You may know Erin, but she is the acting deputy director at the Sierra Club, California. So Erin, it's over to you.
Thank you, Cindy. And hi, everyone. Hopefully you can see the slides if I'm sharing my screen correctly. It's good to be here with you all today. My name is Erin Woolley. I'm the acting deputy director of Sierra Club, California. As you may already know, Sierra Club is the nation's largest grassroots environmental organization with chapters in every state. Here in California, we actually have 13 chapters. And Sierra Club California was founded in the 1980s as Sierra Club's legislative and regulatory advocacy branch for all of Sierra Club's chapters in California. Our mission is to promote the preservation, restoration, and enjoyment of California's environment. That mission, along with our national and statewide policies, inform our positions and our advocacy at the legislature. Every legislative session, Sierra Club California staff track and analyze over 500 bills across a range of issue areas, from oil and gas and renewable energy to water and wildlife protection. Today, I'm going to provide an overview of some of the issues that are arising in water legislation this year. As a note, this is by no means an exhaustive presentation, but I'll attempt to highlight just a few key subject areas. Jumping right in to water conservation. Water conservation is a critical component of a resilient water portfolio for California. For several years, the State Water Board has been working on developing outdoor water conservation and efficiency standards as directed by legislation adopted back in 2018. That legislation requires urban retail water suppliers to comply with urban water use objectives. You see more detail in this diagram from the State Water Board on this slide. And that's compiled from a water budget along with bonus incentives and applicable variances. Earlier last year, the State Water Board published a notice of proposed rulemaking to formally adopt the efficiency standards for outdoor residential use and commercial institutional and industrial landscape components, which are the remaining pieces of the standard-based budgets that needed to be adopted. And just as the State Water Board was still responding to comments on draft regulations, these bills were introduced in the legislature, each of which made amendments to the underlying 2018 legislation I just spoke about. Some of these proposed changes were focused on realigning the enforcement timeline to account for delays in the board's process for adopting regulations compared to what was anticipated in the original legislation that had set a deadline of 2022 for adopting those standards. They were finally adopted earlier this year. But some of the other changes were more significant and included legislative changes to variances, the structure of water use objectives, and the factors that the board was being directed to consider when making enforcement decisions. These proposals were likely aimed at providing more flexibility, but given the timing and significance could have disrupted the board's ongoing rulemaking process, further delayed adoption of conservation standards, or weaken the board's enforcement authority. Strong conservation and efficiency improvements are critical to sustainably managing existing water supplies and preventing further strain on California's water resources and aquatic ecosystems. As this all works out, we'll probably see more to come. Relatedly, we've already talked about one of the tools that water agencies have to encourage conservation is rate structures. Those rate structures can be tools to encourage more efficient water use and ensure that low volume users aren't footing the bill for new, more expensive infrastructure that wouldn't otherwise be needed. And as Cindy touched on already, Prop 218, the California Constitution, puts limitations on how property-related fees can be used, and specifically that they be proportional to the cost of service. So in response to recent litigation, there's been a number of bills, including some of those listed here, to deal with the nuances of this as they affect conservation rate structures. AB 1827 specifically is aimed at clarifying that Prop 218 is not a barrier to things like tiered or conservation-based rate structures, and that they can reflect the costs from higher per capita water consumption, including those investments in infrastructure operations and maintenance that could otherwise be avoided by more efficient water use. Similarly, SB 1072 and 2257 are aimed at responding to issues related to litigation over water rate increases and the related remedies that are available. Finally, I bring it back to SB 1255, which would address water affordability, as was talked about already, without violating Prop 218 by creating a voluntary water rate assistance program. I do just want to touch on a couple points. This program is voluntary. There are notice requirements before folks are opted in, and there is an opt-out process so that anyone who does not want to participate can opt out. There are, limitations, and so finding ways to increase water affordability is really critical to continue or to be able to provide affordable water to all Californians. Moving on, like conservation, effective management of water is really critical as California prepares for future water unavailability and the impacts of climate change. Last year, these 3 bills were introduced that each proposed important improvements to the governance and administration of California's water rate system. SB 389, which authorized the State Water Board to investigate the validity of water rates, passed last year and has already been signed into law by the governor. And the 2 other bills I'll talk about in just a moment, AB 460 and AB 1337, became 2-year bills and had the opportunity to be heard again this year. AB 1337, which unfortunately is no longer moving through the legislative process, would have authorized the State Water Board to be able to curtail pre-1914 water rates when water is not available to meet their priority of right. This puts them on a level playing field with all other water rights, which are already subject to the board's curtailment authority. and improves the board's ability to administer the water rights system more effectively. As I mentioned, this bill did not move out of committee, and so it's no longer moving through the legislative process. And then AB 460, which you've already heard a little bit about, specifically was in response to a situation reported on the Shasta River back in 2022, where a water agency violated a curtailment order and illegally diverted water, dropping the flow of the river, as you can see in this chart. The penalties for doing that over the course of more than a week was about $4,000, which is very low. So increasing the penalties, which is what this bill has now been amended to do, will hopefully be able to prevent that situation from reoccurring in the future. California's water rights system is far from perfect, and maintaining protective in-stream flows to support wildlife, water quality, recreation, and other uses has to be meaningfully upheld and enforced to prevent devastating impacts to imperiled species. As we contend with fluctuations in water availability, I would expect that this issue will continue to arise. One other issue that keeps coming up is groundwater management. It's now been 10 years since SGMA was enacted, and groundwater sustainability agencies are at various stages of developing groundwater sustainability plans. In addition to bills looking to address issues over implementation of SGMA, there's also been interest in issues relating to increasing groundwater storage to build California's water resilience. I'll keep it brief for our time constraints, but two bills, AB 2079, AB 828, and AB 2799 are aimed at amendments to SGMA to fill gaps. So 2079 was aimed at filling a gap to ensure that jurisdictions permitting new wells are incorporating important information about impacts to subsidence and drinking water to protect communities. Similarly, AB 828 protects groundwater for the environment and drinking water by exempting them from certain limitations on groundwater pumping imposed by GSAs. In addition to managing groundwater more effectively, as I mentioned, there's also legislation related to increasing groundwater recharge, facilitating ramping up California's groundwater storage capacity. When managed sustainably, groundwater storage can be a tool to store water and effectively plan for future water unavailability. But we can't forget about the impacts on the areas where that water is being sourced from. Specifically, diverting water from groundwater storage can negatively impact rivers and lakes if in-stream flows and wildlife are not protected. Along with ensuring that rivers have enough water to support ecosystem function, we also have to take steps to prevent water pollution from contaminating our waterways and drinking water. In the past few years, there have been a number of bills like AB 1851 aimed at addressing lead contamination in drinking water. This bill specifically is around lead testing to ensure that children are protected at school. Similarly, ensuring that our rivers and waterways are clean and safe to support healthy ecosystems and outdoor recreation. It's front of mind. AB 1798 is a reintroduction of a bill to address the problem of 6-PPD and stormwater contamination. This is a chemical that is highly toxic to salmon. And as we're in the second year in a row that the salmon fishery is closed, in addition to improving in-stream flow conditions, addressing water quality threats like 6-PPD is imperative to protecting the future of salmon fisheries in our state. Finally, the last two bills on this slide are related to dealing with the issue of cross-border pollution in the Tijuana River watershed. This issue is particularly acute for Californians in San Diego, where untreated sewage has led to issues and contamination in Imperial Beach. These bills would address that by increasing state funding, reporting of pollution, and trying to find solutions to address pollution impacts in that watershed specifically. Finally, as many of you probably know, in 2020, Governor Newsom signed an executive order setting a goal of conserving 30% of lands and coastal waters by 2030. It's part of the global 30 by 30 effort. Last year, the legislature passed SB 337, making 30 by 30 state policy. And legislative efforts this year build on that momentum with an eye towards improving statewide wildlife connectivity and 30 by 30 implementation. Some of these bills are more broadly geared towards 30 by 30, while others are focused specifically on species like beaver restoration, fish passage, and wetland improvements related to improving our waterways and species protections in those areas. Much of this legislation builds on years of environmental and wildlife conservation advocacy. Now is a critical moment to continue these efforts in order to meet the state's 30 by 30 goal on time. All right. With the last couple minutes I have, I'm going to touch quickly on the state budget. The state budget has been challenging this year with a significant deficit. Cuts were made to programs across the board. Despite some of these cuts, we were very pleased that the legislature and the governor were able to protect existing funding for the Habitat Conservation Fund, restore investments to the Salton Sea restoration projects, and increase the State Water Board's ability to protect wetlands through permitting and enforcement after the Sackett decision. That said, significant cuts were made to drinking water and wastewater funding, water recycling, PFAS cleanup, and dam safety. And as you've heard, some of these are included in the climate bond legislation. One of the biggest questions I think that remains to be answered is how the legislature and the governor will respond to the budget decision when making decisions about which bills can get through the appropriations process and through the governor's desk. A few of the bills I highlighted earlier have been held in appropriations already due to budget reasons. And earlier this month, AB 1272, which sought to create a drought planning pilot project in coastal watersheds, was vetoed by the governor due to budget constraints, as highlighted in the excerpt on this slide. We'll probably see more over the next few months as the legislative session wraps up as to how the budget will impact final legislation this year. Thank you again for having me. And with that, I will turn it back over to Dee for the dialogue portion of today.
Thank you, Erin. That was very comprehensive, and we appreciate your participation and the participation of all of our speakers today. I'm just going to really quickly go through again how we handle our Q&A here at the dialogue. We ask that you look to the bottom of your screen, or some for you, maybe the top of your screen, but click on the Q&A button and then type in your question. You can also upvote a question, which will bring it to the top of the stack so that we make sure we get to it before the end of our program today. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and go to our Q&A and ask for our panelists to turn their cameras on so that we can respond to questions together. I'm also going to ask panelists, if you see a question in the chat or in the Q&A, please don't respond to it in writing, because some people are listening and they don't have the ability to read, and we want to make sure everybody hears the responses. So I'm going to start out with just a compliment, and I think this went to the early work and conversations about the climate bond from Evelyn Wendell. So you get a bravo from Evelyn. Those of you who don't know her, she's with the We Tap organization, which promotes drinking and protection of tap water. But we do have a question from Diane Wallace, and the question is for you, Joe. She's asking, is there any money for switching agricultural irrigation from rainbird spraying to water-saving irrigation strategies? So she's looking for ag irrigation conservation funding.
There's very limited funding, but there is some for conservation. The legislature will have to sort of structure where it goes. There is money for the SWEEP program, which funds, I think, the kinds of investments she is referencing. So there is some money for SWEEP, and there's some money for water conservation.
Thank you, Joe. Any other panelists want to respond related to conservation or ag conservation in particular?
I think the only point I want to, just to build off of what Joe just said, the way the bond is structured, the money will all have to be appropriated by the legislature. So while there are guidelines, while there are broad categories, there's going to be an opportunity to, once we're going through the budget, should the voters pass the Prop 4 in November, once the money is being allocated through the budget, there's going to be an opportunity to advocate for more specificity. So for example, if in that sweep program, folks want to see money directed a certain way, that would be the opportunity to really advocate for that.
Thank you, Tina. Appreciate that. Okay, I don't see any other speakers jumping forward, so we'll go to our next question. And this is a question about the bond measure as well, asking if there are any mechanisms in Prop 4 that will ensure that for-profit projects that could cause or exacerbate environmental problems, injustices, it says, will not be able to access bond funding. They recognize or they reference Cadiz as a project, and this is an anonymous attendee.
So there's no provision in the bond that allows for-profit companies, and the exception is if they are public utilities or mutual water companies, to access the funds in the bond. They could access them indirectly by working with a water district or some other public agency, but there's not a provision for private companies to apply for money in the bond.
Okay. Anybody else have any comments they want to make related to protective measures? Cindy?
I think it might be good if Tina or Joe maybe highlight the provision in the bond that has a certain percentage going to disadvantaged communities.
Yes. Yeah, it's unique to this measure. SB 867 directed that 40% of the entirety of the bond, so of the 10 billion, be directed towards disadvantaged communities. And that is, it's not on a chapter by chapter basis, and that was very deliberate. There are some chapters like the water chapter, like when you're looking at clean drinking water or extreme heat, where the bulk of that money can be directed towards disadvantaged communities. It doesn't work for everyone, like the fire chapter, for example. If you're looking at fire resilience projects, you may not be looking at disadvantaged communities for that. So we were very deliberate in ensuring that there was overall flexibility in that 40%, but really wanting to make sure that there was a floor of 40% of that funding being directed to disadvantaged communities in the state, and tribal call outs throughout as well.
And Tina, to your earlier point, will that be worked out? Should the bond pass in the next legislative session in terms of any specific, or in the regulatory arena?
It'll be done through both. So you'll have grant programs that will have guidelines that will incentivize disadvantaged communities. For example, we see that in some of the programs that are funded already. I think we'll see that improve going forward, but it will also be done through the budget in the coming years. So not just this next year. We're not going to appropriate all 10 billion this next budget. It'll be over the course of several years.
Thank you. Joe, did you want to add something there?
No, I think that's, there's no enforcement mechanism right now. Our assumption is that the Natural Resources Agency will probably develop a set of guidelines to ensure that we get to the 40%.
All right, thank you. All right, our next question also comes from Diane Wallace. She writes that Congressman Henry Waxman showed us how to focus on a goal and make incremental steps towards achieving that goal. He wanted no smoking on planes and started with the last 3 rows on the plane. With that in mind, considering the actual funding need to address climate change, isn't Prop 4 an important step in the right direction? So I guess that would be to those that are feeling like maybe it's not adequate. And Tina, you addressed this early about all the different wants and needs, and Cindy, you addressed this as well. So I don't know if either of you want to address this question. It's really a statement in the form of a question. I'll give you a shot.
I think you'll all know my answer. I would say a resounding yes. This is a pretty impressive giant leap in the right direction.
Cindy, did you want to offer any comments?
No comment.
I mean, I was just gonna say, some money invested in the right place is always better than no money. So it's important for us to, focus on what we have and not what we didn't get. We always go through this when we're negotiating bonds. People, after you've had to cut the amount that was in the bond, people come in and they say, how dare you cut all my money? And you're going, no, you actually have no money. Now you have some money. So it's important to keep that focus, that we start at zero and whatever's in here is, an add-on. So we need to be positive about that and continue to work in the future to try to provide the additional money we need.
I think that'll be a key issue. I know some folks are concerned about what will the opportunities be in the future to keep building towards that. And of course, we'll see what happens in November. Okay, the next question is from Charming Evelyn, who is also with the Sierra Club. Question is for you, Cindy. She wants to know if Aqua supports the building of new dams or only restoration and dismantling of non-functional dams.
Great question. So one of the things that we talked about in the context of the climate resilience bond, first of all, was inflationary dollars for the old, I call it the old Prop 1, so there's not confusion for those projects, but also have some money available for new storage. And what we're not talking about, the old fashioned big dams and that kind of thing. What we were talking about is more localized projects for storage, because, at the end of the day, when you're managing water, part of it is collecting the water. There's also the need to be able to move the water, and often the need to then be able to put the water into groundwater storage. But groundwater storage, you can't just flip a switch and it goes in. That takes time. So the water has to be collected and then put into the groundwater. So there are definitely needs for additional storage in California, but what we're talking about, is more what we call 21st century storage. It's not the huge projects that were talked about in the past.
Thank you, Cindy. Erin, did you want to address the storage question from the Sierra Club's perspective?
I can address it briefly. I think I can say that from Sierra Club's perspective, there are already 1,400 plus dams in the state of California, and so there's a lot of alternative forms of water supply investments that we can make to increase California's resilience. Water conservation being number one, along with recycling, stormwater capture, groundwater management, that can go a long way towards improving California's water resiliency from a local and regional perspective without causing the kinds of environmental harms that we see with new dams and massive reservoir projects.
Thank you, Erin. Our next question is from Tony Wilkinson. Tony says the summary of this year's wins and losses on the budget was environmental equals preserved. People, drinking water, recycling, recharge, dams, dam safety equals reduced. Now we know the priorities of the legislators and also advocates like the Sierra Club. What is the message about yes or no for the mixed bag on both water-related bonds on this ballot? So both water-related bonds, I'm not sure the reference to both. There's a climate bond on the ballot. Is there another bond related to water on the ballot? Joe, I'm going to go to you because you know a lot about what's on ballots.
There is a measure, I think it's Prop 5, that changes the vote requirement for local infrastructure projects, and that would include some water projects. It changes it from a 2/3 down to a 55%. I wasn't quite sure what the question, what we're actually asking. Was it one of the prospects of the ballot?
I think it was, what is the message about yes or no for the mixed bag on both water-related bonds? So Tony's viewing the climate resilience bond as a mixed bag, and asking what the overall message that sends is what I assume. And by saying environmental items were preserved in the budget, and water infrastructure he's defined as drinking water, recycling, recharge dams, dam safety being reduced in the budget. He's suggesting that sends a signal as well. So I guess the question is, do any of you agree that it was the environmental items that were preserved in the budget, and that these other items were reduced?
I guess I would say there's no question that in the budget, there were reductions in planned investments in water and various other kinds of environmental projects. We believe the assumption of the administration was that some of that would be made up for in the bond. And I would say some of that, not all of it, has been made up for in the bond. In some other areas, the bond went beyond what we'd had in the budget. So on balance, I think we're better off with the combination budget and bond. Would have been better if they hadn't made the budget cuts, but the state was facing pretty dire budget circumstances, so they really didn't have a lot of choice.
Anybody else want to weigh in on this? Thank you, Joe.
The one thing I'll add, having, worked on the bond for 5 years, and when we initially introduced it, you've got this is pre-COVID, et cetera. We had, I guess what you can call a normal budget year, and really thought we needed to put a bond on the ballot to see greater investments. And then we saw COVID, and what we anticipated was going to be a real shock to the budget. And you'll remember, state employees were furloughed. There were cuts made because we anticipated a real hit to the budget due to COVID. Coming out of COVID in 2021 and 22, we actually saw a surplus. And that's when the legislature and the governor had the opportunity to dedicate extra funding to programs that are important to all of us. And then as soon as that funding didn't materialize, as soon as the budget went into a deficit, we had to pull back on those commitments. And, that's heartbreaking for all of us, but it emphasized to us why general obligation bonds are so necessary. Not only can we fund these important programs over a longer duration, which is helpful when you're trying to implement these programs, when you're working with community groups to get the on the ground funding going and get the projects implemented, but it is also not reliant on sort of the boom and bust cycle that our budget experiences so often.
I think that's helpful, Tina. And I will say, I jumped down to look at the Q&A, and Tony did clarify his question. He's really, where he's going is that there's a lot for the environmental issues in the climate bond. And is it worth the funding for that? Is the funding for the water infrastructure worth it for the funding for the environmental? His language is lavished on environmental causes, but so the question is the balance between what is being funded, and now I understand his question. I think it's an opinion, so perhaps.
I would just argue that it was pretty carefully balanced here. I know there were folks on all sides who wanted more, but there's a certain balance of political interests within the legislature, and that's what they had to work out.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Okay, Tina and Cindy, there's a question from Evelyn Wendell, beyond the Bravo from earlier. She's asking, where are we at with regards to reaching and educating renters with water quality information? We're investing in so much, and the public also in general is in need of specificity and helpful information to promote our mutual goals. So this is a communication investment question. And thank you, Cindy, for your comment. In crisis, solutions have to be planned. So what are we doing to educate the public about water quality information, particularly renters?
Well, I appreciate the question, and certainly for customers that aren't renters, that have a house in their community, they receive reports from their water agency about the quality of the drinking water. But for renters, I'm not sure about that. So that's a good question that I'd like to learn more about what the answer is.
Aaron, or say Tina, you actually, this question was to you as well, so I don't know if you have any insight into this, or if Aaron, you might, from the Sierra Club's perspective.
I don't have any additional insight. I know that when it comes to water quality, if there's an exceedance, and Cindy, you know this better, that needs to be reported. How that gets reported to renters as opposed to just local resident, homeowners, I'm not sure.
And I think, it would be good to look on the local agency's website for consumer confidence information on their drinking water. That may be there as well.
Yeah, I think so Evelyn's looking for something proactive that's getting out into the community. And I know she knows a little bit about this, so I think this is a prompt. Aaron, did you want to offer anything?
I don't think I have anything to add on that at this point. I think the question speaks, I think, more to the local programs that I think the folks who are executing them are more able to speak to.
Thank you, Erin. So Tina and Joe, the next question from Charming Evelyn is for you. And Joe, you have done this for many, many years, so I know you'll be prepared to respond to it. How do you work with the environmental community on bonds? How do you incorporate their voices and the voices of the tribal community and disadvantaged communities?
Tina, I think you should start this one.
I'm happy to. I would say environmental community, the environmental justice community, tribes. Over the course of the time we were working on this measure, we held countless meetings to get feedback on funding priorities, and not just, who wants water, who wants fire, but drilling down deep into which programs are working for community groups and which aren't. So for example, if we were going to direct funding for extreme heat, what is working on the ground for community groups that are trying to access this funding? Do they have an easier time working with the agency or the department? Is this particular program working well, or is that program working well? So that was the critical feedback we were able to get from groups and then incorporate into the bond. And we got a lot of letters and a lot of feedback, not just with asks, but with specifics on how to direct the funding, and what, telling us what works well for these community groups and what doesn't. People were really, really engaged, I'm happy to say.
Joe, did you want to supplement that?
I want to take it from a slightly different perspective. I think that, my clients on the bond are all environmental groups, but their focus is, how do you get to a resolution? So a lot of the legislation we fight over in Sacramento are majority vote bills that, one side wins, the other side loses. It doesn't really work that way with bonds. The challenge is you have to have a balance where every major interest group has to feel like they got something, that this moves the needle on their issue, but nobody's going to get everything they want. So the challenge is, how do you find the balance that'll be politically acceptable that gets you to a 2/3 vote and a signature? And that's the really hard thing to work through. It's a lot easier in a lot of bills to just take a yes/no kind of partisan ideological perspective. The bonds, you really have to balance all the interests and make sure that you're really addressing all the key issues.
Thank you, Joe. Excuse me. Aaron, as the environmental organization on the panel, did you want to say anything here?
I don't think there's anything specific to speak to on this. I can say that, Sierra Club, along with many other environmental organizations, did submit a unified priorities for the bond, and I think appreciate that where those were incorporated, where they were able to in the final legislation.
Thank you. I do want to say, having a bond go through go through legislative committees, at least gives a better shot for public engagement across the board than some that are developed outside
Yeah.
and are not always as informed in the process, even if it comes late. So Cindy, would you disagree with that? I'm looking at your face, trying to read your face. You're on mute. There you go.
Yeah, I'm a big believer, and I think Aqua's a big believer in good public processes. One, public process issue for the bond was that things took so much time internally that at the end there really couldn't be a hearing where people could say, well, we're just seeing this paragraph, we'd suggest changing it this way, because there were 2 hearings, which I think that was really good that those 2 joint hearings, one in the Assembly, one in the Senate, and I think it was good those were held, but those had to be informational hearings because it was too late to amend. So, in an ideal situation, the bill would have come into print earlier so that there could have been hearings on it. But certainly on the SB 867, the prior version, there were hearings on that, and that was going through the normal legislative process.
Oh, Dee, I think you're muted.
Well, I was saying while Cindy was talking to go ahead with the next question, so apologize for that. And it's a clarification on your answer to water storage and what do you consider smaller projects? Is that spreading grounds, direct injection into aquifers, or what kinds of projects were you talking about that Aqua is supporting?
Yeah, and just stepping back a second, a lot of us have worked a lot on the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund program, and when you get into that law, it's talking about not just safe water; it's talking about an adequate supply. You've got to have the water to have safe water, right? So, in one example, there can be an above ground tank for a community. That's storage. There can be smaller reservoirs. We haven't at Aqua formed a definition of what we're suggesting. We ought to work on that. But I think it's important, like if you read, I pulled out the a statement, the governor has a water supply strategy, and he talks about in his administration, they talk about different tools for water management, and storage is one of those. And they identified the need to develop over 4 million acre feet of new storage facilities, with other estimates, besides that one, there's other estimates that place the need higher. So it's an important category. It's not the only water management category, but it's an important one. And I don't expect Dee to speak to this, but if you look at Metropolitan and Diamond Valley Lake, that was something where their agency saw that reservoir, that was needed. And that took planning, that took investment. And through the last drought without that for Southern California, that could have been a huge problem. So, storage is an important part of water management. Water use efficiency, water conservation, that's important. Water reuse, we need to augment existing water supplies. So they're all important tools, but storage is an important piece of the puzzle, and we need to be collecting water.
Thank you, Cindy. And with that, I see the rest of the comments in the Q&A are just that comments. I'd ask the speakers to please see them because there's some compliments in there. And I'm checking to see if Connor is back. It looks like he is. He had to step off for a second. So I'm turning the program back over to you, Connor. And thank you, everyone, for participating today.
Yeah, I want to thank all the speakers, and I want to thank the audience and those that asked questions and that's hung on to listen to it all. It's an interesting discussion. I also got a text during this time that said yesterday was the hottest day on record in the globe. So we're facing all these issues daily, including friends I know up in headwaters of the Feather River of another set of fires going. So it doesn't end, and we need to deal with it. And moving forward, I want to let everyone know that we are always dark. We don't have a meeting in August. So our next meeting will be in September, the 25th of September. We need always like suggestions on ideas and possible speakers. So you can forward those to any of us on the committee. And I think that's it. But with that, I will say, see you in the fall, and good night and good luck. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.